The Ice Shard Sorcerer still kicks major taint in Season 4. I'm Noodle, and we're going to talk about it. So the way this build works is it's heavily reliant on mana, but our main skill is Ice Shards, and specifically Destructive Ice Shards. Destructive Ice Shards, when it's cast and it hits all of its bolts on one person, they become vulnerable, so you get a free vulnerable basically forever. Now, like most other Sorcerer builds, you're going to want to enchant Firebolt, so your first 2 points go into that. The way that this build fleshes out later on is you retain a lot of benefits from burning damage, whether it's damage reduction from burning targets or extra damage to burning targets. Most Sorcerer builds are oriented around using cooldowns. They're a good way to generate mana and actually a barrier, which in turn gives you more damage if that stat is still retained here in Season 4. Now, that being said, going down the list, we have Shimmering Flame Shield because it heals you for half of your life every time you use it. Shimmering Teleport as you gain damage reduction from that, and you end up actually maxing out Teleport. You want to be able to move around. Mobility is really important. Ice Armor with the Enhanced Ice Armor rune because it gives you more mana regen. And then a maxed out Frost Nova with Mystical because you get even more vulnerable on everyone around you. Frost Nova, by the way, is your biggest damage dealing AoE ability, and I'll explain that in the playstyle section, but just stick around. You'll see why. As for the ultimate, we go with my favorite, which is Deep Freeze. It resets all of your cooldowns, but it's also just really badass to use. Now, the key passive that we're using is Avalanche, which gives your abilities a chance to make your next cast free and deal extra damage, and that chance is doubled against vulnerable targets. Now, the way this kit works is most of your enemies, if not all of your enemies, are vulnerable at all times, so this is massive. Now, before we get to the aspects, the few passive abilities that I think you need to be going for is Devouring Blaze, as again, you're kind of doubling down on the burning damage thing, Mana Shield, Protection, and Glass Cannon. I feel like those three are pretty standard for most Sorcerer builds. And then the two enchantments that you do use is Ice Shards. This one's really important, and that compounds with your Frost Nova. That's why that's your biggest AoE ability whenever it's off of cooldown. And then, of course, the other one is Firebolt, which we mentioned earlier. That gives us the burning damage on every single thing that we use. Now, speaking of aspects, the main ones that you're going to want to use are Piercing Cold, which gives your Ice Shards a piercing effect, Frozen Memories, which is arguably your biggest aspect because it gives your Avalanche a second cast for that free chance proc, and then Elementalist, which gives you a huge increase to your critical strike chance if you cast an ability at or above max mana. And then for the two defensives, Disobedience, I feel like every single build in this entire game runs Disobedience, and then Snow Veiled because it gives your Ice Armor an effect that gives you more armor after it depletes. Now, moving on to stats, this is dramatically different from the previous seasons here in Season 4. It's now a lot easier for just about anyone to understand, which is fantastic. Now, that being said, a couple of things that you want to look for offensive stats is cooldown reduction, and then the other one is anything that bonuses your mana, whether it's mana cost reduction or plus to max mana, etc. Now, the defensive stats that you want to look for, again, are cooldown reduction. That's one that I think everybody should double down on, especially on most Sorcerer builds. That's got to be one of the most important. And then damage reduction stats like armor, all resistances, or even just plus to life. So for the Paragon, I know there's so many options to choose and so many things to click on there. It's easy to get lost in the sauce, so I like to use the max roll guides, and they look a lot like this. If you follow them super closely, you'll notice that they kind of double dip into burning damage and shield damage. That's because what we were talking about earlier in the skills section, when you enchant Firebolt, you add a burning effect to everything, so you really get to kind of reap those benefits here in the Paragon board. Now, a key note that I like to do in Paragon boards is I like to retain like 20-30 points to myself and just put them wherever I want because there's so many options, and sometimes I feel like I'm not tanky enough, so I need to divert a couple of points to that. Or if I'm too tanky and I don't do enough damage, then I'll do it that way. Now, the few glyphs that we're going to use is Elementalist, Flame Feeder, Reinforced, Destruction, Control, and Exploit. So yeah, if you have any issues when it comes to Paragon or anything like that, and it's hard to understand that stuff, use a guide. Like I said, Maxroll is very good at this. You can just either copy paste exactly what they have or just kind of tailor it to be your own, you know? Now, for the Endgame Gear, obviously Tal Rasha's Ring is a huge one. You do extra damage for each element type that you're using. Another big one is Raiment of the Infinite, which is really, really helpful for this build specifically because the way that your targeting works is you don't have a whole lot of AoE unless they're really close together. And then there's Godslayer Crown, which does the same kind of idea where it clumps everything together. Every time you damage either an elite or a boss, it'll bring all extra mobs right into your epicenter of destruction. Now, the playstyle for this one is almost akin to a sharpshooter, but like you have to be in melee range for your big AoE burst, but like you're still mainly a ranged sharpshooter until your Frost Nova's off cooldown again. It's strange and it's clunky at times, but it still manages to chop it up with the best of them. Objectively, this build is very fast at killing elites and bosses, but comes up a little short in the mass AoE department, meaning it just doesn't chain AoE as well, but it has huge AoE burst. I put this up on the Pit Clapometer and it put up a piercing cold 4 minutes minutes and 25 seconds, placing it not super high in its unoptimized form. In my opinion though, this build, while clunky, is still very fun to play, especially if you play into its strengths, which is of course bosses or elite hunting. I give this one a solid 6.9 out of 10. Now the real question is, what are you planning to play this season? Do me a favor, and if you enjoy this content, make sure you subscribe or even hit the like button. They're both free and they actually really help out the channel here. And you can also hang out with me here live on YouTube. I try to stream at least once a week, but the best way to stay up to date on that is join my Discord and pay attention to the announcements tab in there. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and if you're bored, YouTube recommends this next one for you. Happy grinding, travelers, and we'll see you in Sanctuary.